Okay, so we're going to try to do a small voice recording for each chapter of A Tale of Two Cities, where I'll read it to you and then kind of go through and explain it and maybe hit the high points of some allusions or devices that you might not be familiar with. We'll see if I do it for every chapter. I don't know. I'll at least do it for chapter 1 for you poor, poor people who are absent. So, if you look at your table of contents, just to do a little setup, A Tale of Two Cities, although it is one single book, one novel, it's actually split into 3 tiny books, 3 tiny sections. You have book the first, which is titled Recalled to Life, book the second, titled The Golden Thread, and book the third, which is Track of the Storm. Titles are very relevant to Charles Dickens' work. These are not things you should just skip over. The first 6 chapters of A Tale of Two Cities are called Recalled to Life. Those first 6 chapters that comprise book the first all involve someone being resurrected, metaphorically speaking, recalled to life, right? That's what it comes from. Those first 6 chapters are exposition. They are just setting up and giving you all the background information you need to know to really appreciate the story itself when it starts in book the second. Okay. Now, chapter 1 from book the first is called The Period. And we're not talking about period like a punctuation mark. We're talking about the time period, the setting. If you look at chapter 2, it's called The Mail. Guess what? It's going to deal with mail and the night shadows and so on and so on. Okay, so pay attention to the titles because they're either a symbol or a clue about what's happening or something. They're relevant, okay? Don't just skim over them. So we'll start with book the first, Recalled to Life, chapter 1, The Period. And I am not reading this in a British accent right now. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on it being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. And that, my friends, is the first sentence of A Tale of Two Cities. This is why Charles Dickens can sometimes be confusing. He uses a lot of words. Now, if you look at it, every clause of that sentence starts with the same word choice, right? It was, right? That literary device, if you remember, is called anaphora, right? Same words, phrases at the beginning of successive clauses, etc. Okay, so it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. He uses that anaphora to set up this comparison, this juxtaposition, if you will, between the two social classes. It was the best of times and an age of wisdom and belief and light and hope and heaven and all of that for the upper class. Everything was great to them. And at the same time period, it was the worst of times. It was an age of foolishness, darkness, despair for the poor. And because of these massive extremes, you're going to sort of start seeing the building of the revolution. And then there's that little part at the end where Dickens says that the period then was so far like the present period, they can be compared, essentially, because this is set, which you're about to see, in 1775. Dickens is writing this story in 1859. In 1859, it was also a time of extremes. Okay. It was, England was leading the Industrial Revolution at the time period. I mean, you had all of these technological advances and scientific things going on. And at the same time, England was also like full of like superstitious beliefs and like spiritual hoaxes and mediums and all of this stuff. So extremes. The time period back then was full of extremes. The time period that Dickens is writing in was full of extremes. That's just kind of what he's setting up. And that whole first sentence, paragraph, whatever you want to call it, is riddled with rhetorical devices. I mean, there's just tons of literary devices in there. You have the anaphora, which is by far the dominating device. I mean, this is one of the most famous examples of anaphora in the history of the written word. You've got kind of this paradox going on, because how can something be the best of times and the worst of times? But it is. It's also, I mean, just really simply contrasting, or this fancier term called antithesis, where you have balanced grammar structure for opposite ideas. I mean, you've got a lot going on there. And there was even that euphemism, right? Because Charles Dickens was writing during the Victorian period, and Queen Victoria was known for being rather prudish and very prim and proper, whatever word you want to use. So saying hell would have been frowned upon. So instead he says, we were all going direct, wink, wink, the other way, right? So a euphemism. So lots going on in that first part. Then we move on to the next paragraph. There were a king with a large jaw, and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw, and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. In both countries it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state, preserves of loaves and fishes, that things in general were settled forever. Now, in that paragraph, you've got the two monarchies. You've got the English monarchy ruled with the king with the large jaw and the queen with the plain face, which is saying she's rather homely looking, right? Not super pretty. And that would be King George III and Queen Charlotte Sophia. And if you look at pictures of them, you'll see it is a reasonably apt description. And then you have the king with a large jaw and the queen with a fair face on the throne of France, and that would be Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, very famous for their excess and for getting their heads chopped off. So, and I think maybe their furniture too, but that's a different story. So these are your rulers. He says, in both countries it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state, preserves of loaves and fishes, the things in general were set up forever. Okay, that could be a little confusing because he's got a couple biblical allusions going on in there. And allusions, you know, if you don't know what they're referencing, you kind of miss the big picture, right? Okay, so the phrase clearer than crystal is typically an allusion to Revelations 21:11. Okay, so biblical revelations, right? The end of it all, right? Doom, destruction. Not so great for the masses, right? So here we've got a reference to the doom and destruction, and not so great for the royalty, right? It's kind of foreshadowing the whole Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI heads getting chopped off stuff building up. You've also got the loaves and fishes, right? Which is an allusion to the loaves and fishes. This is a miracle performed by Christ in Matthew. And that's whenever he multiplied all the loaves and fishes to feed the faithful and the masses of the hungry. Well, here he's using it ironically because your narrator is nothing if not sarcastic. And he uses that comparison to, Jesus feeding the faithful masses to the royalty who, instead of taking all of this surplus and the preserves, right, they keep it for themselves. So people who aren't hungry keep all the food away from the people who need it, kind of in a nutshell, if you will. And those people, those rich people, just think everything's settled forever. Like, this is the way it is, and it's gonna last forever, and everything's great. Right. And he continues, he says, "It was the year of our Lord 1775, which is perhaps the longest way possible to say it was 1775. This is what happens when you get paid by the word. Spiritual revelations were conceded to England at that favored period, as at this. Now, when he says spiritual revelations, he doesn't mean like religious. He's talking spiritual, kind of like superstitious, ghosts, talking to mediums, people who say they can commune with the dead and, tell you where grandpa hid the silver, that kind of stuff. That's what he's talking about when he says spiritual revelations. Mrs. Southcott had recently attained her 25th blessed birthday, of whom a prophetic private in the Life Guard had heralded the sublime appearance by announcing that arrangements were made for the swallowing up of London and Westminster. Even the Cock Lane ghost had been laid only around a dozen of years, after rapping out its messages, as the spirits of this very year last past, supernaturally deficient in originality, rapped out theirs. Mere messages in the earthly order of events had lately come to the English crown and people from a Congress of British subjects in America, which, strange to relate, have proved more important to the human race than any communications yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. So, again, you've got a couple illusions going on here, you have a lot of illusions going on here. And this is the thing with Dickens. He's writing in 1859, right? His readers of that time period are going to catch a lot of these references. We don't. We're not British and we're not living 100 plus years ago. So here's the general breakdown. Mrs. Southcott was a real person. And she was believed to be, for lack of a better term, a prophetess, right? She had visions, the whole thing. At one point towards the end of her life, when she was pretty old, I think she's 63, she announced that she was pregnant with the second Christ. And people, a lot of people actually bought into this. They bought her, baby stuff and all that. And she legitimately really did, believe in her predictions and stuff like that. She even, would write them down in a letter, seal it, give it to people, and then let them wait to see if it would come true and stuff. So she had a, pretty decent following of believers. But when all of that stuff went down and, she realized that she wasn't pregnant with the second Christ, and she died, and they did an autopsy and all of this, right? So it was all a hoax, right? It was all determined to not be true. Then it has another one to the prophetic private in the Life Guard, who has a prophecy of the swallowing up of London and Westminster, and that was actually a real thing too. There was a private in the Life Guard who had predicted in 1750, which was the year that Joanna Southcott was born, that there would be an earthquake that would basically swallow up, destroy London and Westminster. And, of course, that didn't happen either, so it was fake. And then he mentions the Cock Lane ghost. And the Cock Lane ghost was allegedly a ghost that haunted Cock Lane in London. And they believed that it was this spirit of a woman who had been murdered and her body had been hidden, and she was, haunting the alleyways and all of this stuff. And later, of course, that was proven to be a hoax as well. So none of this stuff is real, right? And then you have the little parenthesis side note where the narrator turns to us and he's like, all of those little hoaxes are supernaturally deficient in originality, as supernaturally deficient as the people who are doing all of that stuff today, because there were still spiritual mediums and seances and phrenologists, the people who could kind of predict stuff using the bumps of your head and all of that. That was really popular during Dickens' time period. So he's like, yeah, this is all nonsense. He was big on making fun of that kind of stuff. Then he's a little snarky, a little sarcastic when he has that next sentence, and he says, mere messages in the earthly order of events had lately come to the English crown and people from a Congress of British subjects in America, which it's so strange to relate. It's just crazy talk that those announcements have proved more important to the human race than any of the communications from all of these supernatural spiritual mediums. That is referencing the Continental Congress. Okay, the first Continental Congress. So not quite up to the Declaration of Independence, but all of those letters that we sent in 1775 building up to it. Okay. Then we keep going. We move to France. France, less favored on the whole as to matters spiritual than her sister of the shield and trident, rolled with exceeding smoothness downhill, making paper money and spending it. Under the guidance of her Christian pastors, she entertained herself, besides, with such humane achievements as sentencing a youth to have his hands cut off, his tongue torn out with pincers, and his body burned alive, because he had not kneeled down in the rain to do honor to a dirty procession of monks, which passed within his view at a distance of some 50 or 60 yards. He's very obviously being sarcastic. I mean, he says, France entertains itself with these very humane achievements, and then he goes into the most brutal description of the torture and murder of a young man. And that, just so you don't think he's being random in his descriptions, is actually based on something that really happened. Give me like 2 seconds, I can find the guy's name. Oh, there we go. Chevalier de la Barre. In 1766. That actually is what he was accused of, and that was his punishment. In real life, they softened the punishment and let him be decapitated before they burned him. But the original sentencing was exactly that, like have his hand cut off, tongue torn out with pincers, and to be burned alive. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So while that's going on, he continues, and you get all this nice little foreshadowing building up here. It's likely enough that rooted in the woods of France and Norway, there were growing trees when that sufferer, so that youth, was put to death, already marked by the woodman, fate, to come down and be sawn into boards to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it. Terrible in history. It's likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillers of the heavy lands adjacent to Paris, there were sheltered from the weather that very day rude carts, bespattered with rustic mire, snuffed about by pigs, and roosted in by poultry, which the farmer, Death, had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the Revolution. But that woodman and that farmer, though they worked unceasingly, worked silently, and no one heard them as they went about with muffled tread. The rather, for so much as to entertain any suspicion that they were awake, was to be atheistical and traitorous. Oh, I love that part. Oh, it's such beautiful foreshadowing. You have all that personification going on. It's really cool. So you have to visualize it. Just imagine a woodman. Okay, and that's fate. That's fate personified. And the woodman is walking through the woods, and he looks out into the distance, and he sees that youth being put to death, and just shakes his head and just starts marking trees. Just marks the trees. And those are the trees that in a few years are going to grow up, get cut down, and used to build the guillotine, the certain movable framework with a knife that comes down and chops your head off, and the head rolls into the basket. It's terrible in history. And then he's got to visualize death, and death is walking, and he's just a farmer, and he looks off into the distance, and he sees that youth being so cruelly punished. He just shakes his head and keeps pushing his cart, his tumbril, which is going to be the cart they used to take the prisoners from prison to the guillotine to die. And that's it. It's all foreshadowing. And then that last little sentence, anybody with eyes who's paying attention could see things weren't going well and should be able to figure out that if we don't fix this problem, a revolution's going to happen. But to even entertain that thought, to even suggest it, to say it out loud, was to be considered atheistical, right, godless, and treasonous, and you would be punished too. So that's France. Now we go into England. In England, there was scarcely an amount of order and protection to justify much national boasting, which is just a really ironic, kind of cutesy way of saying that England was really lawless and crime-ridden. Daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. Families were publicly cautioned not to go out of town without removing their furniture to upholsterers' warehouses for security. The highwayman in the dark was a city tradesman in the light, and being recognized and challenged by his fellow tradesmen, whom he'd stopped in the character of the captain, gallantly shot him through the head and rode away. The mail was waylaid by 7 robbers, and the guard shot 3 dead, and then got shot dead himself by the other 4, in consequence of the failure of his ammunition, after which the mail was robbed in peace. The magnificent potentate, the Lord Mayor of London, was made to stand and deliver on Turnham Green by one highwayman, who despoiled the illustrious creature in sight of all his retinue. Prisoners in London jails fought battles with the turnkeys, and the majesty of the law fired blunderbusses in among them, loaded with rounds of shot and ball. Thieves snipped off diamond crosses from the necks of noble lords at court drawing rooms. Musketeers went into St. Giles, which is like a really poor neighborhood in London, went into St. Giles to search for contraband goods, and the mob fired on the musketeers. And the musketeers fired on the mob. And nobody thought any of these occurrences much out of the common way. So, he's so sarcastic, and it's just funny. He's talking about how lawless all of these things are, and I just want to point out to you, because I know you don't know this, but every one of those things he mentions is something that really, really did happen in real life. Those are all allusions to real events. So the highwayman and the city tradesman, that one, there's actually a report in, I don't know what it's called, somewhere they kept track of. It's called Annual Register. That's what it is. There's an Annual Register, and for the Annual Register of the year 1775, it started describing all of these events. And one of them is where a guy named Mr. Brower was robbed by a highwayman. So that's what highwaymen are. They're robbers. The slang kind of term for them is captain, right? So he got robbed, and then he's like, hey, that's Joe. I work with him. Called him out by his name, and then the robber shot him through the head. Then the mail got robbed. The whole thing, like right down to the number and the failure of ammunition, that was based on a real event. The Lord Mayor getting mugged, right? Mugged in broad daylight with all of his retinue. That really happened. The prisoners in the jails fighting with the turnkeys, and then them going in and firing blunderbusses, so guns, right? They're firing guns at them. All of this is real stuff. He's not making any of this up. He's not exaggerating. He's not even just saying, maybe it's something that could have happened. No. These are all 100% true, real events. You can look up and find the exact details of every one of them. It's crazy talk. It's crazy talk. It's so violent. I mean, if we were standing there, we would be like, what is going on? It's madness. We are not in Oak Cliff. What is happening? But no. For them, it's just like, oh, it's Tuesday, right? They didn't think anything of these occurrences was out of the common way. They're just like, oh, it's normal. Yeah, here we go. And in the midst of them, the hangman, ever busy and ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition, now stringing up long rows of miscellaneous criminals, now hanging a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday, that's swift justice, now burning people in the hand at Newgate by the dozen, and now burning pamphlets at the door of Westminster Hall, today taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow of a wretched pilferer who had robbed a farm boy of 6 pence. So, all of those equally based on real stuff. The burning of pamphlets at Westminster Hall, they burnt seditious material, right? Traitorous material. The ones that got burnt at Newgate at this time period was Crisis number 1, 2, 3, one of them, which were written by Thomas Paine, which hopefully from history you know who that is. He's super famous and really, really important for us, the American Revolution. Also, the atrocious murder being hung. I mean, you kind of like, okay, I mean, right? But then he follows it up with that wretched thief, pilferer, who had robbed a farm boy of 6 pence. So, change. He stole pennies, basically, and he gets hung too. So the justice is not so just. And even though the hangman's working non-stop, it's completely and totally useless. And all these things, and 1,000 like them, came to pass in and close upon the dear old year 1775. Environed by them, while the woodman and the farmer worked unheeded, those 2 of the large jaws and those other 2 of the plain and the fair faces trod with stir enough, and carried their divine rights with a high hand. Thus did the year 1775 conduct their greatnesses. And myriads of small creatures, the creatures of this chronicle among the rest, along the roads that lay before them. So he says all of these things are happening right in and around 1775, and the women and the farmer are just building up to the revolution, while the king and queen, right, the upper class, the royalty, are just trotting around like they own the place. Divine right is where they believed they were given their power by God, so no one could ever take it away. And it's their divine right. And they are just waving it around with a high hand. And that's how the year passes, conducting their greatnesses, just stepping on all the little people. And then it says the myriad of small creatures. That's going to be all of the little characters, the little people, who are going to make up the heart of this book. The road before them is like a way of saying like to their destinies. So this year just kind of carries them forward to their destinies. And that is the end of chapter 1. I hope it wasn't too painful for you.